Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Omensight, technically Definitive Edition because they released that as an update for the PC and PlayStation 4 versions of the game, and they released it entirely as Definitive Edition on Nintendo Switch. What you're seeing here is the PC version. In the interest of full disclosure, I was provided a review copy of this to take a look at. This is an action-adventure game with role-playing elements by Spearhead Games and was released for PC and PlayStation 4 in May of this year, with the Definitive Edition following on Nintendo Switch, actually this month. And with the release of the Switch version, they also rolled out an update for the PC and PlayStation 4 versions that would bring them up to the Definitive Edition as well. On its original release, it did get a bit of a mixed reception, although it did tend more towards the positive than the negative on that. And I do have to admit that I did not actually play the game on its original release, I just didn't have time back then, and I've finally gotten time to do it now that Definitive Edition is out. So now that the so-called definitive version of the game is out, what exactly are we dealing with here? Let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. Well, in terms of presentation, it does run on Unreal Engine, and it's very similar to their previous game in a lot of ways. It still has that very highly stylized look with quite a lot of colors going on, and since the game does technically take place in the same universe, it does have a very similar look overall to Stories: The Path of Destinies, with the anthropomorphic characters and the overall design of the architecture and things like that. The animations are nice and smooth, the particle effects are flashy and vibrant, and the overall look of the game is rather good, although it does have a noticeably muted color scheme compared to Stories: The Path of Destinies, although that's definitely a stylistic choice given the subject matter of Omensight versus Stories: The Path of Destinies, which was a lot more lighthearted than what you see in Omensight. There is, however, one major issue with the visuals, and that's that they're just too busy sometimes. Particularly when you get into big fights, you'll see a lot of particle effects going on screen, and that will often get in the way of seeing the different cues you need to be able to dodge effectively, or to counterattack effectively, and that sort of thing. So that does get fairly annoying sometimes, and as far as I've seen, there's no way to really fix it. You just kind of have to deal with it. Similarly, there's no way to fix the camera. It's a fixed perspective, and while you can sort of turn it with the right stick on your controller, it really doesn't help much, and you just end up having to deal with the suboptimal camera angles most of the time. Now, luckily, the camera angles never get so bad that the game becomes unplayable or anything, but they always remain a mild annoyance throughout, and that does negatively affect the game. But once you move past the visuals and you move over to the sound design, you find that there's not really anything to complain about there. The voice acting is generally quite solid across the board. All of the characters are voiced reasonably well, although some of the lines here and there are a bit iffy, but that would be just about any game in existence. The sound effects themselves do their job reasonably well, although nothing particularly stands out in those. And the music itself is also quite solid, although again, not very much of it stands out. There are a couple of tracks here and there that do, but the vast majority of it just ends up fading into the background and behaving like a soundtrack ordinarily does, which is to accent what's going on but not be particularly overwhelming. So overall, they've done a rather good job with the presentation, although it does certainly have a few issues here and there, one of which, the camera, is something I'm surprised they didn't fix, having known it was an issue in Stories: The Path of Destinies. But regardless of what's going on with the presentation, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. The story in this is set in the land of Euralia, where the Pagarian Empire, under the leadership of Emperor Endric, has unleashed its military might in an attempt to conquer all of Euralia, where the last remaining holdouts before they accomplish that goal are the small nation of Rodentia, which is really more of a ragtag group of rebels than anything else, with the last hope of any sort of peace arrangement dying alongside the godless priestess who was murdered before the events of the game. It is into this hopeless scenario that you are introduced. You play as the Harbinger, a mythical warrior who is supposed to show up right around the end times in order to try to prevent the end of the world. And you've got your work cut out for you, because right at the beginning of the game, it tells you just what's at stake by having the Void Serpent Voden show up and devour the world right then and there. And after showing you what it is you're trying to prevent, you're summoned back to the Tree of Life by this mysterious witch who is assisting you in your investigation of what exactly happened leading up to this and how you can fix it, and you are told exactly what you're supposed to do, which is to use the bindings of fate that you establish with several of the main characters throughout the course of the game to go back in time to the beginning of the day on which they met their end, and try to piece together what exactly happened leading up to the end of the world, and why the godless priestess Vera's soul did not reincarnate, because that's something that's supposed to happen in order to help to preserve the balance of the world and try to prevent the Void Serpent from showing up in the first place. And as you continue to progress throughout the story and go through your investigation, you not only get new clues as to what exactly happened leading up to the end of the world, but you also gain access to visions of the past called Omensights, which not only give you major pieces of information, but can also be used to persuade other characters to behave in different ways. So let's say you go through Ludomir's Day and you got all the information you could from that, and then eventually you unlock a new Omensight. Well, you can go back to Ludomir's Day, and instead of going through the way that it did before, you can bestow the Omensight on him. Then that might actually change his plans, and the events of Ludomir's Day will unfold in a different way, giving you more information of a different sort. And the game does give you the impression of being able to go through the days of any of the characters you have access to at any time, and trying to find out what exactly is going on with them, and using the Omensights where it's necessary. Except that when you get your first Omensight, it immediately shuts off anything that you hadn't already looked into at that point, just from basic observation. So despite the impression at the beginning of the game that the narrative is going to be non-linear, any of the branching paths you go on in the narrative ultimately all end up in the same place, and you do ultimately end up with the same ending regardless. Now don't get me wrong, I understand that it's very difficult to do a non-linear mystery story because you want to unveil the right things in the right order to keep things really interesting and fresh, but the way this thing implies a more non-linear narrative and then just kind of blindsides you with the linearity of it does mean it's a bit disappointing in that regard. But that said, it does do quite a good job of creating an interesting mystery story, at least at the beginning of the game, up through about the 3/4 way point. Once you get to the last quarter of the game, it really starts to lose steam, and the last quarter of the game basically comes to a fairly abrupt halt, and it does feel like the game was rushed out the door to meet a deadline. Now this is where I do have to mention that a lot of people have complained about the ending being very unsatisfying and being rather abrupt. I'll agree with the abrupt part because again, it does feel like it was rushed out the door to meet a deadline, but it is worth mentioning that a lot of people who say that played this before the Definitive Edition was a thing, because Definitive Edition introduces a second ending, which you can obtain after getting the first ending and going back into your complete game save file and getting any of the remaining clues that you might have missed through your first playthrough. You don't have to satisfy any crazy conditions in order to get that second ending, it's just finish the game first, and then go back into your save file, get any remaining clues you might have missed, and then you can get that final ending. And that ending is considerably more satisfying than the one that the game originally shipped with. So that does help the game out quite a bit. It does also help that the characters in general are pretty well done, although they do have some issues here and there, mostly with regards to how they relate to the narrative, like in the case of Draga, for example. But apart from those type of issues where certain characters just don't fit all that well into the narrative, or if they are fitting well into the narrative, their role is fairly limited, they do generally have a fair bit of nuance to them, and they can be fairly likable at times. And while the story and the characters, and especially the storytelling, are not as charming or interesting as stories The Path of Destinies, they're all quite serviceable and do end up keeping the game pretty interesting for the about 6 hours that it takes. And that's a good thing too, because the gameplay formula is what ultimately lets this thing down. Most of what you're going to be doing throughout the game is engaging in a pretty basic hack-and-slash combat system where you have light and heavy attacks, you have a dodge button, and you have various special abilities like being able to slow down time in an area around you for a short period, or being able to do a dash maneuver, or being able to pick up objects and throw them through telekinesis. If you time your dodge right, you can follow up with a quick counterattack, and you are ultimately trying to keep up your combo in order to build up energy, which you can then spend on special attacks, like a Phantom Blast, which is basically just an energy blast that you throw at things, or being able to do effectively an instant kill maneuver where you hold down the heavy attack button and you'll just dash straight through an enemy and instantly kill them, unless of course it's a particularly powerful enemy, in which case you'll just do a lot of damage to them. If you take damage while you're in the middle of a combo, that does reduce the amount of energy you have, but it's not that difficult to get that energy back. And generally speaking, the combat in the game is actually quite easy, even though they do gradually introduce more powerful enemies as well as more varied enemies, like enemies that will throw various projectiles at you, or do area effect attacks, or have shielding that you need to get past, or things like that. And because of this, the combat does become very repetitive very quickly, and it's a good thing that the game is as short as it is, because otherwise that would overstay its welcome. That was actually a similar problem with stories The Path of Destinies, and it seems that they didn't really learn their lesson from that with this one. They did at least try to spice things up a bit by having you venture alongside the companion that you decided to go along with for that particular day, and you will be able to call in their special ability, which may either be an area effect attack, or to give yourself a speed and damage boost, but most of the time I found that using those abilities wasn't really necessary unless I was trying to get to a specific location that I couldn't access normally otherwise. This does lead me into other aspects of the game besides the rather repetitive and easy combat system, like, say, the exploration, where as you're wandering around the various environments, even though you'll be going through the same environments multiple times, depending on what abilities you've unlocked, you may be able to access different areas. This is most notable in the instance of the seals, where you'll see these different colored locks on certain doors that you won't be able to access until later in the game, once you've unlocked the sealing ritual for it. And once you have that, you can go back to that area in a particular memory, and then be able to access that door and find what's in it, which is usually a treasure chest full of amber, as well as some experience points, as well as a memory, which is a text collectible that gives you some insight into the background of different characters. Occasionally you'll also see cracked walls and nearby explosive barrels that you can throw into that wall to access a new area, or if you don't have access to a barrel, then you might need to rely on a companion's special ability to break through that wall. But that's pretty much it as far as the exploration goes, and it does ultimately feel like a missed opportunity there. Especially considering that the only thing you can really do with the amber currency is go to the anvil at the Tree of Life in order to offer up the amber to receive different blessings, which are basically just static bonuses, like increasing your health, or increasing your energy, or increasing damage resistance, or damage output. And while the Aegis upgrades and the blade upgrades do change the appearance of your armor and your weapon respectively, the rest of it doesn't really have all that much of an effect, except for just some slight bonuses to your capabilities. And by the time you get to the first ending of the game, not even the second one, you'll probably have all of these upgrades, because it's really not hard to get that much amber. So there's really not a whole lot going on as far as the gameplay goes, and while it is certainly competent in that regard and is solid enough for you to be able to get through the 5 or 6 hours it takes to finish the game, it does ultimately expose the flaws of the system that Spearhead Games has set up for Stories The Path of Destinies and Omensight as far as the general gameplay loop goes, even more so than Stories The Path of Destinies did, because at least Stories The Path of Destinies was actually quite a charming game with a lot of personality. Omensight doesn't really have that going for it. I mean, sure, for a fairly small indie production, it's got quite a bit of polish, the general presentation is quite solid across the board, and it does have some solid, albeit occasionally seemingly incomplete writing on display. It just doesn't have the charm that its predecessor did, and that ultimately makes the repetitive gameplay all the more glaring a fault. So ultimately, I'm giving this a 3 out of 5. It's definitely not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just not quite as good as its predecessor, and if you are interested in this style of game, then you may just want to wait for a sale before you pick it up, because you'll still probably be able to get something out of it regardless. But I would say that if you haven't played Stories The Path of Destinies already, then you may want to look into picking that up before you look into picking up Omensight, because they're both by Spearhead Games, but Stories The Path of Destinies is quite a bit more charming. Thanks for watching.